Propaganda by the Seed is a joint collaboration between Edgewood Nursery and the Soulcast. To get 10% off of your Edgewood Nursery order of plants, seeds, and trees, visit edgewood-nursery.com and use Soulcast at checkout. And if you want to support the Soulcast, you can go to patreon.com/SOLEONE. Now, before we get into this episode, let's hear from some comrades in the Channel Zero Podcast Network.
You were born a hunter-gatherer. You were born a social animal, one that moves within the land and moves between bands in a world that was meant to be less measured, less exact. We were meant for lives with more meaning and less consequence. A life where connection and meaning are implicit, where animals have voices and trees have stories. A world where rivers flow unabated and water isn't a health hazard. A world without fences, a world without flags, a world without rulers and gods. It's our world, the world of primal anarchy.
We are here to say that either the world burns or the cities do. We're here to say that abusers convince you that you have no choice. We're here to say that marketers convince you that you have their options. We're here to say that you are wild, that you can be free. We're here to say that there's a match in one hand and bull cutters in the other. And we aren't here to say that the world is waiting. We are here to say that the world is fighting. We are here to say that their story only ends one way. We're here to tell you that there are others.
Primal Anarchy Podcast is a collection of rants, tirades, condemnations, readings, musings, explorations, response, interviews, and iterations hosted by Primal Anarchist writers Kevin and Natasha Tucker.
Find us online at primalanarchy.org, all major podcast platforms, and the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network.
All right. Aaron, what up?
Not too much. The sun is beaming down. It feels nice, and shit is, still on fire, but maybe less so a little bit. We've crossed that first hurdle towards getting rid of Trump, even if it's for Biden, who still sucks, but what you gonna do? It's better than Trump. So
yeah, I was my friend Sage Francis had tweeted something like, "Look, let's just face the fact. Like, your president lost to a shitty candidate, a shitty person, and suck it up. You guys suck, basically." I just thought it was
fair enough.
But yeah, we're outside on your porch. Just 20 minutes ago, I was like, are we going to need to make a fire? And now we're out here. It's sunny. It's beautiful. It's a great day to be here on your homestead or nursery. Do you refer to this as a homestead, a nursery, a farm, your house?
Yeah, all of the above. Yeah, I don't really know what homestead even really means, but I do live here, and most of the food production we eat rather than sell, so I guess that's a homestead sort of thing.
Do you think of homesteading as a settler concept?
Yeah, kind of, which is not a great feeling, but it's also, I think, has a lot of connection, at least, here and now, to the, back to the land movement, which I think is a more positive connection. The people who I know who are, growing their own food, or growing a lot of their own food, and are really, more kind of living in tune with the natural world, are mostly all homesteaders.
Right.
And a lot of them are doing something useful for the indigenous people around here, at least trying to be on the team, so to speak. So I don't know, it is what it is. We're we're both people of European descent, and even if we wanted to, we couldn't just like go back to Europe.
Right.
So we kind of have to move forward in.
Well, especially now.
Yeah, just kind of got to move forward in the situation that we live in, and try and work towards a better future without getting too wrapped up, or like not. It is important to like know the context of the past and to try and like remedy the wrongs of the past, but without like getting lost in the like negative emotions of it.
Totally.
Like focus on the practicalities of what can we do moving forward to make things better.
A kind of settler futurism.
Decolonization. But that's one of those words that is like people like to throw around, and I think it unfortunately gets used in contexts where it's like, well, that thing is cool and all, but it's not necessarily making that much of a difference.
Have you checked out that Indigenous Anarchist podcast?
I've been meaning to. It sounds really cool.
I really love it.
But I haven't actually listened to it yet.
Their episode on like decolonize this was just like, I was like, they all had like different perspectives on it, and that's what made it like because it's not like a monolithic.
No, yeah, totally.
But yeah, I don't know. I guess I was just struck recently because I have like an anarchist friend who has an awesome farm, and he like, talks about homesteading as like this revolutionary practice, and it just kind of like took me as it surprised me to hear people like reclaiming that term in that way and using it in that way, like building, like I think of autonomy, not homesteading. But it just boils down to like languages and bullshit. It's about what you do and how you treat people and what your practices are. And
for sure.
Well, so we're nearing the end of the year. We had our first however many episodes we did, and we were talking about kind of like reflecting on the year, but also talking about like nursery stuff and like end of year food forest stuff, and just like I've learned so much from you about how to propagate trees and plants and like all these weird fucking plants that I've had so much trouble growing in the past. And so I thought I thought it would be cool to just kind of talk about that shit and like let people know, hey, you can get a seed for some of these trees for like 30 cents as opposed to spending $30 to have it shipped to you.
Yeah, totally.
But I guess before we get into that, I'm curious how your work with
Presente?
How did you started working with Presente to help them with their food production projects? How did that go?
I would say it was a mixed bag. It's been good working with them. As far as like actually how much food got produced at Mount Joy specifically, it was like, this is not a ton. And but that collaboration will hopefully go into future years, and future years will presumably be better as we've got like, we already did a bunch of soil prep. This was like the worst drought year like in records. And so that was like one aspect. I've also just been volunteering for Presente for a while, just doing like regular shit, just like driving a truck and a trailer worth of food, from point A to point B. And that's been cool. I think that organization's doing a lot of good work. And they also had another like more farm scale site that was pumping out a lot of good produce for quite a while. And again, like hopefully that continues into next year and subsequent years where it'll, weather will be better, hopefully. And the prep work's already done. So
that's awesome. Yeah, it was cool to see that, popping off. And it's like, for me, I like wanted to do so much this year, and just with the kids and the family and shit, it was like, I don't know, we just needed to do things for like mental health and go swimming and
for sure
be on the ocean. And so it was like I didn't even really get to do all the things on my farm that I like wanted to do. I just kind of maintained everything, let things get a little bigger, cut down some trees, but other than that, it was like pretty disappointing as far as like how much food we produced this year. And but that's part of the process, is just learning, plugging holes in the ship, and keep going.
Yep, for sure. And there's always stuff that works out great and stuff that's like, I tried and that crop just didn't work out. So that's why I always have diversity, because there's always something that you thought was going to do great and just doesn't work out. So it's good that hopefully something else did.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, kale is just always a winner for me. I just can never eat enough of it. But yeah, man, it's funny, like, I don't know, like, for people who haven't been following our podcast from the beginning, like, this podcast sort of just started out because, we met and, you had all this information about all this shit, and I kept interviewing you, and then it was like, hey, let's do a spin-off podcast. And it's been, honestly, probably some of my favorite work that I've done as far as like podcasting stuff. It's like, it's so natural and fun, and like some of the feedback I've gotten from it are like from people who don't even grow food, but just love hearing like these like casual yet nerdy yet like radical conversations about this stuff. And it's been cool to get that kind of feedback, like, oh yeah, it's just kind of relaxing to listen to people talking about plants. And I'm like, if I wasn't growing food, I don't know if that would be relaxing for me to listen to. But
yeah, if I wasn't interested in plants, I don't think I personally would listen to this podcast. But I'm glad that all sorts of people are enjoying it. That's cool.
Yeah, so I don't know. Is there but we're looking back on our first year. Is there anything that like sticks out to you, or that you learned, or like particularly, I don't know, enjoyed that we?
Yeah, I mean, when we started out, it was basically just you and me, and we would talk about like a specific plant or a group of plants, and that was fun. But I definitely have really enjoyed having guests, because that way, like, I'm also learning, and it just brings an interesting depth. Like, I could go pretty in depth on a lot of different plants, but when we're talking to someone who spent like the last 5 years breeding perennial kale, I don't have anywhere near that kind of depth on that particular subject. So that's been really fun, and it's just interesting to hear, a snippet about what other people are doing. And I definitely look forward to having more interesting guests in the future.
I've really enjoyed just saying Brassica oleracei. From like my hip hop background, it's like one of these phrases like Brassica oleracei. It's like, it sounds like something you could rap really fast if you wanted to sound smart.
Yes. Yes, using botanical Latin certainly gives the illusion of smartness.
Yeah, I like also, like, that we sort of broke the mold that we had in the beginning and just did like whatever like we felt like doing.
Yeah, totally. Like we've had a few episodes that weren't really focused on a particular plant, which was kind of the framework we started off with. And I do like that depth of looking at a particular species, but it seems like everyone has other things going on too. So like we had a great conversation with Zach Elfers about Apios, but also cultural burning.
Apios is in groundnut.
Yes. Yep. So yeah, I think that's worked out really well.
Yeah, I mean the thing about that like the serendipitous element of like selfish for me about like some of the like a lot of the plants we covered, like groundnuts, stinging nettle, and elderberry. Like after doing this and learning all this stuff, I've discovered like a path by my house that's like half a mile long that's just all stinging nettle.
Wow.
And so like
that's really interesting.
And then at the end of that path, you hang a left and you're on the Androscoggin River, and it's all I'm exaggerating, it's not all stinging nettle, but there's so much of it. Like we could go there with shovels digging up so much stinging nettle. And then like you go down there, you take a left, and along the banks of the Androscoggin, I've just found so many groundnuts, and I've just been digging them up. And you know, I gave you like a little fritter I made, but and it just blew my mind to like, you know, find these groundnuts and think like, you know, are these here because this was like a waterway where indigenous people, you know, Wabanaki, travelers were like cultivating these along the way? Did they grow naturally? And it's just like, in listening to that podcast and knowing that, and then like right across the street from all that is like this huge elderberry stand, and so it's like my fun little like it became instantly practical.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah,
I'm very curious to check out that stinging nettle patch, just to see if it's regular stinging nettle or wood nettle, they're very similar looking. But regular stinging nettle, this is in the woods.
Yeah,
you don't see that much regular stinging nettle in the woods in Maine, so it could very well could be wood nettle.
Would wood nettle still sting you?
Yep.
Okay, well, you know, I'll send you a photo as I'm driving home. I mean, they're still they're still growing in this little microclimate. So
yeah, very cool. Yeah, I mean, either way, they're both very similar, great plants.
Is there a difference?
Yeah, they're actually from different genera, and the flavor's a little bit different. How they grow is a little bit different, but there are large patches in woodlands in Maine of wood nettle, which is a native species. And then stinging nettle is a little bit... there's not a ton of them around in Maine, not like, say, the Pacific Northwest where it's growing in every ditch. And stinging nettle has kind of a weird... thing that actually happens with a few different species, where that species was already present in North America before European contact, but for some reason the European genetics of the same species tend to be more aggressive, so a lot of the like feral stinging nettle grown in a ditch somewhere are of European descent, and the original populations that were here are like kind of scattered and few and far between. Kind of a similar thing to elderberries, where we have wild elderberries, and then there's like more cultivated European elderberries, and generally speaking, they're the people consider them to be the same species.
Right on. Yeah. It's weird because they're nowhere else.
Yeah.
They are nowhere else in a mile from my house. I've gone through all the woods. I've looked everywhere for shit to eat, and it's just this one path, and they're just all along this path. And
yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, but
cool.
Yeah, I don't know. Other than I think what I was just blown away by, like the depth and nuance, and like the radicality, I guess, of like the analysis, and just the way that the people we talk to, like, you know, just looked at the world. You know, like I found like a lot of the sort of permaculture stuff that I had encountered kind of had a more NGO-ish sort of, you know, not a very radical approach to me from what I encountered, but like through the people that you know, and the people like who are really deep in this shit, are like very anti-civ, you know, very like, you know, I mean, not as a monolith, but it's just like these strains of like anti-civ sentiment. I'm thinking of like people like Dusty Hines from the Experimental Farm Network, and even like, you know, like Zach Elfers and
yeah,
people
totally
like that. It was just like, it's just like when you're just hearing these people talking about this shit, making all these connections, like, just like my brain just starts tingling, and I'm just like, oh my God, this is so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a pleasant surprise when someone who's doing this, like, amazing plant work is also kind of, like, on the same page politically. And I'm like, why is that? Like, I can't quite wrap my head around, like, how these political ideas and, like, an interest in plants, how is that linked? But it just keeps happening, so
dude,
there's something there.
It's the word radical means to get to the root.
That is true. That does make good sense.
So that's, once you get to the root, if you really get into the root, you got to really get to the root. But yeah, I don't know. So if people are listening and there's, you have feedback for us, like, pop us emails. Let us know what you want to hear more of, what you want to hear less of, what sort of feedback you have for us. We're getting ready to launch season 2. We have one cool idea at least. And so it's like, it's always nice to get feedback. Like, you kind of have to ask for feedback to get it. So by all means, if you have suggestions, feedback, comments, you can email me, SOLE@SOLEONE.org, and you can email Aaron at
edgewoodlandscapes@gmail.com. And yeah, if there are any particular plants or groups of plants you'd like to hear about, or people that you think that we should talk to on this podcast, that's particularly helpful feedback. That would be great.
You know what else? You know what else kind of blew my mind is that when I look at the statistics for how many downloads and listens we get per episode, when they come out, they average about 2,000 downloads or 2,500 or whatever over the period of a month. And I noticed that between the most popular episodes we had was like the mulberry episode.
Oh, interesting.
And then for me it was like my coronavirus and civilization podcast with Kevin Tucker. Like, those two were like really popular and it just was like really cool to me to think that people who are like listening to this for like anarchism or radical politics, or because they're a music fan, that they're like, because when we first started doing it, I was like, can we get away with this? Can we do this? And it's like, fuck yeah, we can. So yeah, it's been a fun journey. Cheers. Well, yeah, so I don't know if you have anything else to say about that.
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
I mean, you sure you don't want to pat ourselves on the back a little more, but what a great job we've been doing?
No. I have enjoyed doing this podcast so much that if people are listening to it, that's awesome. I'm happy to like put out something, another useful thing into the world, hopefully. But even if it was just like 5 or 10 people listening,
totally,
it's so much fun and so little work for me because you do all the editing and I just have to like sit in front of the mic and talk about something that I could really just talk about all day. So yeah, it's been super fun, and I listen to so many podcasts that it's a trip to do my own podcast. Yeah.
Well, do you think, has it been like because of like the coronavirus, like when I first moved here, you were constantly teaching classes on everything from like, how to have an insectary to like whatever you're geeking out on, whether it's nixtamalization or, just like random shit, just like whatever the fuck you've been geeking out on, and at Resilience Hub in Maine. And, you haven't really been doing that.
No, I haven't.
So like, it's kind of fortuitous to still have an educational platform, I guess. Yeah, that is
great. And hopefully one day I can get back to doing in-person classes. But, I think I only had like one in-person class this whole summer that was on seed saving, and it was outside, socially distant, and not a big crowd. So, that was nice to be like, oh yeah, this is a fun thing to do. And now here we are going into winter. It's not pleasant to sit outside for extended periods, present weather accepted. And, coronavirus is spiking all over the place, even in Maine, where we've had a really easy time compared to the rest of the country. It's like, nope, that's not happening for at least 6 months. God. I'm not going to be doing any in-person classes.
That's insane.
I might try and do some Zoom stuff, but it's not the same.
Yeah, you need to be able to read people. You need to be able to, like without the body language, it's just like, I don't know, it's... kind of like college, I think, would be more fun, just because it's like you can just wash dishes and listen to lectures or whatever. But
yeah.
How many dishes do you really need to wash? Well, so yeah, like I was saying in the beginning of the podcast, or as we discussed earlier, one of the cool things about becoming friends with you is just learning, how to grow all these plants. And so I guess I just wanted to talk about like plant propagation, like the easy stuff, how to get started. When you are reading about all these plants and hearing about them, it seems like, daunting, or you can go to Burnt Ridge Nursery and get some stuff. But even just to be able to plant an 1/8 acre of stuff, you're going to be spending, if you're buying trees, and plants and stuff, you're going to be spending $500 to $2,000 or more if you want to really be growing stuff. And people listening to this podcast, they might not be balling like that.
Yeah, that cost of initial plant material adds up really quick if you're buying, already grown plants. But if you can grow your plants from seed, which is great for most species, there are some, especially trees, that the improved cultivars, improved in quotation marks, because sometimes that doesn't always work out. Because a clone that grows really well in Maine isn't going to do very well in Southern California, say. But for certain trees, it really is nice to spend that $20 to $50 on a tree. But especially for something like nut trees, say, or if you have the space to be planting a lot of any given plant, it can be really economical and fun and interesting to grow from seed. I was thinking I would talk a little bit about fall planted seeds, because a lot of perennials, and especially trees, require this thing called stratification, which means they need to experience a bunch of cold weather before they're going to germinate or start growing. And the reason for that is these seeds are produced in late summer through the fall, and if they fell on the ground in September and you got a few warm days in September and started growing, they wouldn't really have enough time to grow into a plant that's going to survive the winter before winter came along and killed them. So to prevent that from happening, these seeds have evolved this mechanism, and there's a few different types of mechanism.
Can I cut you off really quick?
Yeah, go for it.
So that's only for temperate plants, right? Not for tropical.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or desert, but some deserts do have freezing. Anyway, yeah. Just wanted to clarify.
Generally speaking, for temperate climates, I don't think I know of any tropical plants that require that. Usually tropical seeds are you want to, as soon as you get them, put them straight in the ground. But yeah. So planting in the fall makes a lot of sense for a bunch of different species. And for small seeded plants like perennial vegetables, a lot of perennial insectary plants, stuff like that, I like to start them off in what's called a community pot. And that just means that you're planting multiple seeds in the same pot. I'm growing at not a large scale, but more than most gardeners would. So I usually use a 5-gallon pot for my community pots, and I'll fill that 3/4 of the way up with good compost without any weed seeds in it, and then water the pot, and then put about an inch of like really fine, nice potting soil on top of that and plant into that. On a smaller scale, you could use whatever containers are around. Even like a 4-inch pot is totally fine, and you could get up to maybe 100 seedlings out of a 4-inch pot. And you can now is a wonderful time if you have time to be sowing those plants. But really, you can do this anytime in the winter, as long as you can get the materials to not be frozen into a block of ice. So you could even, if you're real busy, you could prep a bunch of pots now and then, do the more careful work of, actually sowing the seeds anytime throughout the winter. And for overwintering those, they don't really need much. They can be anywhere. They don't need sun. They're not going to need water because everything's going to be frozen up. The really important thing, though, is that they stay level. Because if you've got these little seeds in there, and it's at any sort of angle, when you get snow melt or heavy rain or whatever, a lot of that is going to be prone to wash away. So you don't want that. So just having a pallet that's nice and level to throw those pots on is great, but even just a level piece of ground is perfectly adequate.
And I feel like sometimes in my pots also, I've noticed like they're like the community pot that I learned from you. But like maybe I didn't make it level, and like all the tune trees are over in one corner or something.
Yep, I have definitely had that. Like you've got exactly half a pot that's like super dense, and then there's nothing on the other side. It's like, it was close to level, but not quite. Another really important thing to take into consideration is labeling, because you might think that you'll remember what you planted in that pot, but you probably won't. So you never want to use...
I'm getting really defensive.
Never want to use a Sharpie because they just fade way too quickly. My absolute favorite marking tool has become a grease pencil, which is something I learned about from Buzz Ferver, Perfect Circle Farm.
We gotta have him on. That guy's cool.
We'll definitely be interviewing him sometime soon, if he's into it. But a Listo brand grease pencil is like this little plastic pencil, and you put sticks of grease in it and write with it, and it'll write on a wet surface. It'll write on basically anything, and the grease comes in multiple colors. So if you have like black nursery pots, which I have tons of, you write on those with white grease, and none of them have washed off yet. According to Buzz, I think he said like they last about 5 years outside.
And is that what you use for your signs in the garden when you label stuff as well?
Yep. So I really like those. Paint markers also work, but the grease pencils are super cheap. They're like $2 or something, and then you can get like 72 refills for like around $10. So yeah, highly recommend those. Another option, if you don't want to buy something special, is a number 2 pencil, which lasts quite a while, depending on what you're writing on. And like scraps of vinyl siding work really well, or scraps of Venetian blind make decent plant markers.
Is that what I'm looking at?
Yeah, all those little signs are made of vinyl siding scraps. I used to use a lot of Venetian blind scrap, but the problem with that stuff is it's just small, so it tends to like blow away or get lost, or the vinyl Venetian blinds degrade in the sun after a while, and then they break into tiny pieces, and you spend 15 minutes picking up tiny pieces of plastic. So I try to avoid those now. Now I pretty much just write on the pot. Another thing that happens is if you make a little label out of something and stick it right in the edge of the pot, everything in the pot freezes and thaws, and at some point it tends to fall. Your label will fall down into the soil and disappear. So if you are making little labels that you stick in the soil of the pot, put them like not necessarily in the middle, but definitely not on the edge, and you'll lose a lot less of them.
Yeah, I have those little, those little plastic things, and like I always can't read them by the time I have to read them, and so it's good to it's good to know about the grease technique.
Yeah,
and
grease
also,
pencils.
but fuck those things. I don't really like them. It would be.
Yeah,
Yasmin's really excited to like make nice signs for our backyard, and so it's like that's like a fun winter project.
Yes, totally.
So like the plant, so plants that we've talked about, or plants that we're excited about that would be good for this, would be like Hoplitzia, Turkish rocket. You correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here.
Yeah, those would be great. Good King Henry and Turkish rocket and Good King Henry. Neither of those particularly need stratification, but the spring is always such a busy time, and they'll both pop up substantially earlier if they're planted in the fall, and then just whenever the conditions are right, they're just going to pop up when they're ready.
And they're not really going to do very
done.
much the first year anyway.
Yeah.
So. I mean, yeah, you wouldn't say Good King Henry does a lot the first year, right? Or would you?
If it's in rich soil and full sun, you could probably get a crop in the first year.
Again, I'm feeling defensive. Yeah, so, and then, lavender, other...
lavender, rosemary, Schizandra.
Rosemary requires stratification?
It's usually, and the weird thing about rosemary is a lot of times if you buy, commercial seeds, they'll come pre-stratified.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And Schisandra, we haven't really talked about Schisandra, but, it's a Chinese medicinal fruit that, is quite a cash crop for you.
Yeah, it's, selling the plants is a good chunk of my nursery business, and then I usually have a little bit of fruit to sell in the year. And this year I'm going to try selling Schisandra fruit tincture as a value-added product.
Oh, nice. It's so delicious and weird.
It really is. It's like the most flavorful fruit I've ever tasted. And not everybody loves the flavor, but I really do. I love to eat it in oatmeal and stuff.
Yeah, and you had it dried in pepper things, which was... I keep meaning to bring you a packet of Berber, and remind me next time, because it's I think Schisandra and sumac actually would lend itself really well to that.
Yeah, I definitely want to experiment more with it as a cooking ingredient, because it's so weird. One thing I have made is a cranberry sauce with Schisandra in it.
Oh, wow.
That was fabulous.
Was it lacto fermented, or
no? It was just cranberries, Schisandra, some sort of sweetener, probably sugar. Cooked.
Awesome.
It's very tasty.
I mean, it's one of the best things about these is sharing this stuff and seeing what people think. I think this is really cool. Do you think this is really cool?
Yeah, and we should definitely do an episode on Schisandra.
Yeah, I guess when we went to visit the Campo de Fiori farm, and saw his hazelnut breeding operate, that was so fun. But just seeing that he had a whole stretch of Schisandra that he. A very large planting of Schisandra. It was, and he did some artsy shit with it, and had it on a trellis.
Everything there is some artsy shit.
Yeah,
but that guy is amazing. And I think the only other time I've actually met him in person is when he came to the nursery to buy Schisandra plants. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. So getting back to those community pots that you would plant now or into the winter, if you put them in the shade, you'll have to water them less. But most of the plants that people want to grow aren't deep shade plants. So if you do that, it's just important to check on them, at least once a week in the spring. And when you start to see seedlings pop up, you can move them into brighter conditions.
Okay, let me ask you, so what side of the house do you generally recommend people put pots on. Is that not how you think about it, or do you think just in the shade?
I usually just stick in the shade. I have most of mine like in the shade by my driveway. But, kind of wherever. I would probably tend towards, like, if I was going to stick them somewhere, I'd put them on the north side for right now, and just let them be cold and frozen, and then in the spring, either when I want to start, like, closely monitoring them, or when these seedlings pop up, move them to the south side. This is in the northern hemisphere, where they're going to get, like, tons of sun, warm microclimate. That'll help them grow. What you don't want is for them to be on the south side in the middle of winter, because because of climate change, these, like, February thaws, and you don't want to have February thaw, 70 degrees out, and all your seedlings pop up, and then 2 weeks later it's like 5 degrees again.
Right.
So I would say in the shade, north side of a building, to let them overwinter, and then when it's like really spring, bring them out into the sun more.
And so, like, a lot of these plants we're talking about right now, like these perennial vegetable plants, like, you sell seeds for these so people can get them from you. And if there's, like, but other plants that you're not selling, where would you recommend? Like, are there any other seed buyers that you like to get stuff from?
Yeah, definitely.
Like I know Sheffield's is one that I've been looking at, and it's like you have to kind of really know your shit. And
Sheffield's is pretty decent. I would, and I mean, there's lots of different sources depending on what you want to be growing. For our region, if you want native plants, there's the Wild Seed Project, and almost all of their seeds should be fall planted, because native plants in this part of the world, most of them require stratification. If you want to plant some really wild, like, unusual things, J.L. Hudson out of California has a very diverse selection of all sorts of different plants. Lots of really interesting stuff there. Experimental Farm Network has a lot of really interesting stuff. Fedco is great for annual vegetables and some perennial vegetables. Almost everything in the Fedco catalog won't need stratification. And then for, like, tree seeds, there's Buzz Fervor at Perfect Circle. I think his website is perfectcircle.farm. He sells mostly nursery stock, but if he has extra tree seeds, he'll usually have them listed on there. F.W. Schumacher is another sort of mainstream woody plant seed source. And I wouldn't necessarily go to them for nut trees. I would try and get that stuff from Buzz first, just because the seeds that Buzz is selecting are, like, selected for, like, the highest quality, the most high production, and Sheffield or Schumacher are both just, like, as long as it's the right species, like, people are growing more trees for, like, timber or landscaping. So they're not really worried about having, like, a nut that is, like, easy to crack out or something like that Buzz might be selecting for.
Can I just stop you right there?
Yep.
But that's for, like, people in New England who are in this, like, sea level moist zone 4 to 6 kind of people.
Yeah,
and so, like,
would probably also be suitable for the Pacific Northwest.
Because that's what I've been buying I bought a bunch of shit from Burnt Ridge, like Pawpaw and something else. But what my question is like, so do you think? So you would say, like, anyone in the country gets it from Buzz, or do you think, like, people should, like, if you are in Indiana, you should be seeking out someone in the Midwest first.
That's a good point. Like, the closer to home you're sourcing genetics, you're kind of giving yourself a leg up on, like, what's actually going to work. So, yeah, like, if your neighbor has an amazing chestnut tree or whatever, you know, that's... your chances of getting a chestnut tree that's also going to be amazing are probably much better buying from or asking to pick up some seed from that person, you know, because they're similar growing conditions. So for New England, I think Buzz is doing an awesome job. And then there's Burnt Ridge, which has such a wide palette of seeds. I have definitely purchased stuff from there that did great. But they're, you know, located in the Pacific Northwest, so that would definitely be a resource for anyone, but especially people in the Northwest.
Yeah.
And they're mostly nut seeds. And they have I would say their widest collection is chestnuts.
But they didn't have any European, Japanese, American crosses. Like the closest I could get was like a silverleaf chestnut seed from them that like maybe had chinequin in it.
Chinkapin,
yeah.
Yeah, and their stuff is pretty dependent on like how good their crop was and how much they needed for their own nursery. They're basically, as I understand, just selling off their excess. And it sometimes sells out really quick too.
They actually agreed to an interview.
Oh, cool.
So I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Well, and then, so I don't. Did you have any? You must have more to say about the plants in the community pots.
Yeah. So once you've got seedlings growing in a community pot, you have kind of two options for what to do with them. You can just grow them on until you've got like one or two sets of true leaves. So those first leaves that pop up are called cotyledons. And then after the cotyledons, you'll get the true leaves. And once you've got a set or two of true leaves, those plants are probably rugged enough to be carefully transplanted. And transplanting them into individual pots or into a nursery bed or their final position is going to let them grow the fastest. But it's also kind of risky at that size. So I would say my general rule of thumb, what I do and what I would recommend is to transplant about half of them. And then leave half in the community pot, either for later transplantation to another spot or whatever. But also then if something comes along and eats all your little seedlings, you've still got some backup. Or if you forgot to water them and they got cooked or whatever, didn't survive transplantation, you've got some backup. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. And generally speaking, plants in a community pot are good for about a season's worth of growth before they get like really, the roots get really tangled or they get really stunted from just being too closely confined.
So, I don't know if you're going to talk about like nuts and trees specifically later.
Yeah, I was going to talk about those separately.
So, like when you say to take half out, like, do you mean like you don't mean like just take half? You mean like thin it to the point?
I usually will just like chunk out half the pot.
And then just like take your hands and spread the rest out or something? Or like
no, often I'll have just like a pot that's like half full of plants and half not. And if I know that they're probably going to be there for a couple months, I might take out, like rather than taking half the pot in one piece, I would take out like 2/4, and that just allows the other plants that are still in the pot to fill in that space more than if I just took half.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of a quick overview of what I would do for small seeded plants. For nut trees or...
let me just cut you off and ask you one more question.
Yep, definitely.
So, with these perennials, right, like I'm like the kind of person who, as soon as the snow melts, I'm like, fuck, I can get out of the house, I can do all this, I'm ready,
Tim, you can actually go out in the winter.
Oh, yeah.
You can put on a jacket and some boots.
That sounds good. I mean, I can like play in the dirt. I can see the dirt. I actually, have enjoyed going out in the winter more because my yard was so infested with deer ticks.
Yeah,
and just
nice.
playing with toddlers in the forest, snow is like the dopest shit in my opinion. But like, so if you're messing with these perennials, like I always have the instinct to just get them out there and put them in the ground as soon as possible. And I'm starting to think that doesn't really make sense anymore.
It depends on how well you can care for them. And that definitely doesn't make sense if you started seedlings inside. But with these community pots that you're planting in the fall or the winter that you're leaving outside, unless you've got them in a hoop or in like some extreme microclimate like the south side of a house, once they're up and growing in the spring, they can basically be transplanted without really any hardening off.
Right on.
So that's another advantage. It's definitely slower than starting inside, but there's less to go wrong, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking like most of the stuff I did last year, I started inside, and so that's why like when I was itching to put it, it's like so much of it just died, and I was like, just calm the fuck down. Like it's going to be a while anyway before this shit produces. So
totally.
Anyway,
so for large seeded plants, especially nut trees, I don't usually fall plant them, and the reason for that is rodents eating them over the winter. There's a few things that if you really just want to get them planted in the fall that you can do to kind of mitigate that risk. If they're in a nursery bed, you can lay hardware cloth, which is like wire mesh, over the soil surface. But rodents, they burrow, so that doesn't always work. And also there's because the pot, like I was mentioning earlier, if it's above ground, it freezes and thaws more than the ground really does. The ground tends to just, there's so much mass there that it doesn't freeze thaw. It like slowly will freeze and thaw over a period of weeks, which is a lot less stressful than constant freeze thaw cycles. So you don't really want to put like a chestnut in an above ground pot. Not that it wouldn't work, it's just you probably won't get quite as good germination. And if you did that, you would want to again put hardware cloth over the soil surface to prevent rodents from eating them. Another trick, if you just want to plant you want to plant just a handful of nut trees, and you want to plant them directly into place, which has this really nice advantage of like the taproot just goes straight into the soil. You're never going to break that taproot by accident, and those trees should establish quicker and better than anything you would be transplanting because of that. There's a trick that I have not used myself, but is just a neat idea, which is you take a tin can and you throw it in a fire to burn off all the plastic on the outside, and then you cut an X into the top of it. You can even use like an old-fashioned can opener, and you kind of bend the triangles that makes in towards the middle. And then you bury that with the nut seed in it with the open end down. And the idea is that the nut seed's going to germinate, send taproot down through the open end, and then a shoot up through the middle of that X that's been bent down. And the can is just there to temporarily protect it. So it'll protect it from rodents burrowing, and then the tree is going to grow out of that, and the can's going to rust away before it girdles the tree.
That is so fucking cool. I'm totally doing that.
And the burning the can is important because modern cans are coated in plastic, and if you don't burn that off, the can won't rust away quick enough.
Okay. That's awesome. That sounds fun.
Yeah. The neat little trick.
I mean,
if you do
fun.
if you do, let me know, because then I can say, and my friend Tim did this and it actually worked.
Cool.
So what I normally do with nut trees and large seeded fruit trees like a pawpaw or a persimmon,
or plum.
Yep, or plum,
or
apricot, anything prunus. All those seeds are delicious to
Stone
rodents.
fruits.
Yeah. Is I store the seed cool and damp over the winter. I have a root cellar. You can do nearly exactly the same thing in a refrigerator. If neither of those are an option, your best bet is to bury the seed in a pretty deep hole inside of something to protect it from rodents getting at it. So that could be like just a hole lined with hardware cloth. It could be a bucket with some holes drilled in it so that the seeds can breathe and water can drain, and then bury that in the ground. You want it to be fairly deep just to try and avoid that constant freeze-thaw of surface temperature. For as long as it's buried in the ground a little ways, that's going to really moderate that. If you've got it in your refrigerator, and to some extent if it's in a root cellar, you want to be checking on it at least once a month, probably better every 2 weeks. And what you're looking for is mold. And if you find that any of your seeds are molding, you want to take them out and rinse them off in hydrogen peroxide or like dilute bleach solution, and then put them back into stratification with fresh material around them. I use damp sawdust. That works really nice for me, but damp sand works fine, and peat moss also works fine. And the one exception to that are stone fruits, like peach, plum, cherry, anything like that. Those they want to be stored cool and damp like all the other ones, but they tend to germinate too early if they're in damp material. So those should normally be stored just like in a jar or a Ziploc bag or whatever, just the plain seeds.
So, like, I remember last year you had like thousands of Nanking cherries that just like popped in your basement.
Yeah.
And so instead you would just store them dry. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, somewhere in the middle. They need to be damp. The ideal is for like the inside of the seed to be damp and basically the surface to be dry. Because that's going to keep the seed alive, because a lot of prunus seeds will just die if they fully dry out. And so you want the inside of the seed to be damp and the outside to be basically dry to prevent mold.
So how do you do that?
You try and dry, like you don't ever like lay them out to dry for like days. You would like ideally wash them and get them nice and clean, and then just lay them out like on a rag until the surface is dry, and then put them in a jar.
That's it. That's awesome.
Yeah. And what I've done in past years is like basically do that and just have like a layer of sawdust on the bottom of a nursery pot, and then a layer of seeds, and then a little bit of sawdust over the top. And I've gotten excellent germination that way because they were just stored in good conditions, but they almost always germinate like just a little bit too early. And I'm either like scrambling to pot them up in the hoop house, or I'm planting them out and they've got like 4 inches of root going already. And it's not quite ideal. Like, I'd rather if they just wouldn't germinate until the ground thawed, and then I could just throw them in the ground.
Do you think that there are just some refrigerators that are just too fucking wet that, like, because I find, like, any of the kind of seeds that I've really tried to store in my refrigerator over a long... I'm thinking specifically of, like, my pawpaw seeds. Like, they kept molding. I'd wash them off. They'd mold again. I'd do the hydrogen peroxide trick. They'd mold again. Maybe it's because I didn't catch it soon enough. But it, like... I don't know. It seemed like the pawpaws, like, maybe even, like, germinated. I don't know what the fuck happened with them.
Yeah. A refrigerator is a much less consistent environment than most root cellars. Like, my root cellar I'm like getting it down to temperature right now by leaving the door open with a fan in it at night. But once it's down to temperature, it'll be between like 33 and 35 all winter. And I only go down there like every few days to maybe as little as once a week. So it's not getting like opened up to warm like room air and like light and all that stuff. So that it's just kind of a nicer environment. Whereas refrigerator temperatures tend to fluctuate a little bit more. Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, the second batch of pawpaws that I got from Burnt Ridge germinated instantly, and now I got, 25 pawpaw trees growing or something. That's like, just like, shit like that, it's just so cool. Like,
yeah. And I've never done this, but I think Jesse Stevens of Size Trees, I think he stores all of his seeds just in the ground in a bucket. And if you think about like the natural, like seed falls on the ground or is buried by a squirrel, they do fine.
Right.
And they're, not anything special, although the vast majority of them get eaten by rodents.
Right. And then, so like, let's say you have like a community pot with like a bunch of chestnuts or hazelnuts or plum seedlings. You leave them in there for a year?
Often, yeah. And something to consider, especially with nut trees, is a lot of them are tap-rooted. So you want a really deep pot. Or, they could go in a nursery bed. Once you've made it through the winter, then those nut seeds are stratified. You can plant them directly in a nursery bed, which is mostly how I do it, unless I just have like a few of something. Another way to deal with that taproot is something called an air pruning bed. Which could be a raised bed with hardware cloth across the bottom and an air gap. So it's like basically up on stilts a few inches. And what happens with those is the taproot goes down to the bottom and will like hit air and be like, oh, okay, can't grow here anymore. So then the roots will start to grow horizontally. You can do the same thing on a really small scale by cutting out the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket, but like leaving a little lip around the edge, and then pushing a piece of hardware cloth into the bottom.
What do you mean by a lip?
Just like you cut the bottom out, but not the entire bottom.
Okay, so that you can still put something down.
Yeah, and then you take a piece of hardware cloth and push it into the bottom, and it'll sit on that lip, but most of the bottom of the bucket is gone. And then you fill that up with compost or potting soil or whatever you're going to be growing in. And the tree roots will grow down and then stop and grow horizontally.
That is why when I get, and I'm not just like saying it's like sell your products or something, but it's like when I get these seedlings from you, they're fucking like the roots just fill the whole pot. A lot of times, right? Like they're like really well established roots, and they don't appear to be root bound.
Some of that's just timing, because a lot of my stuff's just growing in regular nursery pots. And if I left them there long enough, they probably would get root bound. But it's just like, it's the right time to transplant that thing.
Okay. But so when you have all those like whatever plums in like a community pot, like after the first year, if they're still in pots, if they're not, so like my hazelnuts that are in pots, maybe I should do something else with them right now.
Yeah.
I should maybe plant them into a nursery bed next to the blueberries?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Like, you don't really want to leave, especially woody plants, in a nursery pot for more than a full growing season.
I was thinking about bringing the hazelnuts into my quote-unquote root cellar, but you think it would be better to just put them in the ground now?
Yes and no. Yes, I think it would be best for the plant. No, there's that risk of rodent damage. So if you can mitigate the rodent damage, then yeah, go ahead and plant them. But if that's not an option, then they're probably better off in the pot. as long as they're going to stay cold enough to be dormant.
Okay. And so what would break dormancy? Anything over like 40 degrees or something?
Yeah, pretty much. That's a good rule of thumb.
But the thing, I guess what I'm like trying to get you to talk about is how you like create a bare root plant by like washing it out or something. Like you've described it, like how to like do it, but it just seems like such a dramatic thing to do. It like the idea of doing it just sounds, I don't know.
Yeah, cool. I can talk about that. So most of my plants that I sell as bare roots are grown in nursery beds, and a nursery bed, you basically want like the same kind of conditions that you would have for a vegetable garden, and probably the most important thing is that you have like really loose soil to the depth that you want to be growing at, because if you have like a couple inches of nice soil and then clay underneath, the roots will grow down into that clay and you'll have a hell of a time getting them to come out. Or if you have a couple inches of nice soil and then like really rocky ground, you're just going to have a hard time getting the whole root system. So having a bed that's like really built up with lots of compost, or if you are lucky enough to have naturally good soil, preparing the bed with a broad fork can be really nice to help just like loosen everything up to a deep depth, and then it's basically just like rowing out your seedlings, whether they're direct sown or started in a community pot. Tree seedlings growing in a nursery bed can actually be really tightly spaced, like even an inch apart, because they're not going to be there for very long, usually just 1 year. And really clustering them together often means that they grow straight and tall, because that's just like they don't have enough room to really like bush out, so you get like nice little whips that are off to a good start of having a central leader structure, if that's what you want. I had
not everyone wants a leader. Some people
some of them want a more horizontal structure. I had a bed of Nanking cherries.
Dad jokes.
That I just intentionally cut them off like halfway mid-season so that they'd have a more bushy structure. Mostly just as an experiment of like, okay, this plant's eventually going to be a bush. What happens if we start it on that structure earlier?
What about, do you ever... Okay, so my other two questions are, do you ever use any kind of liquid fertilizer?
Yes.
What kind?
Captured human urine. That's the only liquid fertilizer that I use, generally speaking. I have a couple of tropical plants that I grow that I will use fish hydrolysate, which I use so little of it that I just buy it. But it's actually pretty easy to make out of just like fish guts and whatever fish waste, which around here is very easy to get. But mostly like I just save urine, water it down between 5 and 10 times, so like 1 part urine, 5 part water, or up to 10 parts water, and fertilize with that, and that's great.
That's awesome. I was what were you saying?
It takes something that's like a waste product and turns it into something useful.
That's awesome.
Very, very permaculture-y.
Do you I was looking at, or one of the things I'm like trying to do or learn how to do is like making fertilizer out of seaweed. I love any excuse to go to the ocean, and I've just seen the shit where people blend seaweed and then they soak it for like a couple weeks or whatever, and then they blend it, and then they take all that water out and then they blend it, and they blend it with the water and then strain out the hard parts, and then you just have like a bottle of liquid seaweed fertilizer. And like a lot of the weed, like when I've grown weed, like kelp is always like the number one ingredient, and so that just kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you know anyone who's done that?
Not off the top of my head.
People sleep on the ocean, man.
Yeah. I think that's probably an excellent source of like micronutrients. And yeah, if it's around, probably wouldn't take a whole lot of work to make it.
Yeah, it's free. I forgot what my other question was. Oh, greenhouses. So, like, let's say, I was lucky enough to, break quarantine, and we disassembled your neighbor's greenhouse when they were getting ready to burn it, and so I have a greenhouse. It's awesome. My daughter, it's like her favorite place, it's a little warmer in there. She's just, like, loving arugula and shit. That stuff is just... I just love that shit. But I'm like, do you think, like, for nursery plants, like I don't see most of your stuff in greenhouses. Is that just because you have so much stuff that it's not worth it? Or, like, if you have young things like hazelnuts or plums or chestnuts, is there a benefit to putting them in a greenhouse? Or what are your thoughts on using the greenhouse?
You definitely speed things up in the greenhouse.
Or a cold frame.
Especially in, like, the early part of the season, and you can extend the season to, finish the season in there. I guess my biggest thing is I don't want to have to burn fuel to heat a greenhouse, so I just use an unheated greenhouse. And a lot of the reason that I don't do more with the greenhouse is that I have the luxury of having very little competition. So I can start stuff when the weather is good to start it, and when it's ready, I sell it. And since there's not anybody else trying to sell Dystania, people will just have to come, like, if I'm like, oh yeah, that'll be ready in July, then they have to, like, wait and order it when it's ready, or stop by in July if they're local or whatever. If I was, like, trying to compete with the spring rush of everyone else, then I'd probably have to have a heated greenhouse to have, like, decent sized stock ready when people are like, oh, it's spring, then they're, like, stoked to plant a garden. Since I don't have to compete that much, I kind of don't. And I definitely start, like, all of my annual vegetable seedlings in the hoop house, unless I'm, starting them on a windowsill if it's, like, a tomato or something that I really want to get a jump on the season.
But, I mean, like, for somebody like me who's not, I mean, like, maybe I could see a time where I'm, like, selling pawpaws in front of my house, whatever. But, just because I live on kind of a busy street. But, like, for someone like me who's really mostly just interested in, like, trying to grow a bunch of cool food and, like, to actually be able to, like, eat it, like, do you, like, for someone like me, there is a benefit to, like, growing those plum trees in a greenhouse. If I just want to give them that extra 2 months of growing, like, that's...
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that doesn't need to be said, but I just, like,
Yeah. If you've got a greenhouse...
questions are sometimes the good ones.
Yeah, if you've got a greenhouse, you might as well use it. If you don't have a greenhouse, for the most part, you don't really need it.
Right.
And, there are certain things that you, like, in our climate, you need a greenhouse. You want to have, like, fresh greens through the winter, you got to have a greenhouse for that. And there's some plants that benefit more from the greenhouse than not, like pawpaws. Often won't pop up until, like, July, if they're not in a greenhouse. So that, like, extra heat and extra time definitely helps a lot with pawpaws. So I always have my pawpaws in the greenhouse. And there's other, like, any plants that, like, want a lot of heat, I'll, like, usually try and start them in the greenhouse.
Yeah, like, after talking to Eric from the Bayou Food Forest, I just got a bunch of moringa seeds and a banana tree in there, and made me, like, want to grow shit like okra. Just why not? Why not?
Yeah, those things for sure in the greenhouse.
Cool. And so, but did you talk about how you wash out the roots?
No. But basically, like, when you're ready to lift bare root plants, and, like, this would be especially for shipping and selling plants, if I generally wouldn't bother to wash them if I was just going to like put them somewhere else on my land. But for shipping and selling plants, I don't want potentially like problematic earthworms that could maybe be in my garden to go anywhere else. I haven't seen any of these
jumping.
Yeah, like the so-called crazy snake worms. I haven't seen them here yet, but any type of worm I would rather not have moving around with nursery stock, or any other potentially problematic like insects or whatever. You just want to get the roots clean if they're going somewhere else. And basically all it means is like I will loosen up a row of plants. If they're really deep or really huge, I'll use a broad fork, but usually I'll just use a spade, and then just gently pull them out of the ground, give them a good shake to get off the bulk of the soil, and then when I'm packing them, I just have a 5-gallon bucket of water, and I just swish the roots around in there, and then pretty much immediately wrap them in damp paper. For shipping.
So I guess the reason I'm asking, again, it's a selfish question, but it's like, so I have like this pot with all these tune trees in it. There's maybe like, I don't even know, 50 or 60 of them.
Nice.
And they're so close together. I feel like I have to do the dip them in a bucket.
Yeah.
Not because I want bare roots to ship, but because otherwise I'm going to fuck those plants up by...
Yeah. If you've got such density, or the plants have been there so long that the roots are really like tangled up, yeah, dumping them in a bucket of water definitely helps to detangle them.
And they'll be okay after that. They're not going to be crazy.
Yeah, there are some plants that really do not like root disturbance, but for the most part, plants can withstand that. Like you definitely don't want to like wash off the roots and then leave them in the sun for any amount of time. But especially like if the plants are dormant. And if it's not super hot out, bare rooting is usually not much of a stress.
Awesome. That's good to know. Yeah, I was looking at them, and I was like, how am I, like, what am I going to do here? Cool. Is there any other, like, stuff about, like, creating a nursery? I mean, that covers a lot of it, right? I mean,
one other thing that is just kind of seasonal that's worth mentioning is protecting woody plants from rodents over the winter. So if you've planted a fruit tree or a nut tree, or really any kind of tree this year or just recently, or you have nursery stock that's still in a nursery bed, it's really a good idea to protect those plants from rodents over the winter, because a lot of rodents eat the bark of young trees as a winter food source, and that obviously is very bad for the trees. If they're seedlings, it's not necessarily like a death sentence, because they'll, what's called girdling, they'll eat the bark off all around. And if it's a seedling, you can cut that top off, and they'll usually sucker back up from the roots. But you don't want that to happen. I like to use hardware cloth to prevent this from happening. And you can put like a little hardware cloth fence around a whole bed of plants, or just like a hardware cloth tube around the trunk of a single tree. And for a lot of places, depending on how wide of a piece of hardware cloth you're using, that's often enough. If you live in a really snowy place, you should probably go out and do a little winter maintenance. And all that really requires is put on snowshoes if you've got them, or boots if you don't, and just kind of walk around those plants that are protected by hardware cloth, just to kind of pack the snow down. Because if the snow drifts up over the top of that little fence or that tree guard, then sometimes rodents will be tunneling through and get into that protection.
So the rodents can't tunnel through frozen earth? You don't need to like bury that mesh guard?
Yeah. I have lost the occasional plant to rodents tunneling through soil, but it was, I think the only one I can really think of was a mulberry that in the spring it was like leafing out, and I was like, that doesn't look quite right. Why is that at that weird angle? And I lifted it up, and it had 0 roots. All the roots had been eaten. And I was actually able to pot it up, and it totally survived. But yeah, 99% of the damage is just them eating the bark. Once the ground is like totally frozen solid, they can't really move through it. And so they're usually like in the like sort of leaf litter zone, and then they'll move up as that like gets an icy layer on it.
Or they'll just like discover your cold frames and be like, "Oh my god,
Yeah, this is heaven."
I'm gonna shit all over this stuff."
Yeah.
Well, we didn't. Is there anything else about that stuff?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
The only thing we didn't talk about is root propagation. Like I had like. I'm not a fan of comfrey. Everybody's like, comfrey is like the perfect plant. I don't understand why people say that. But I just pulled up my comfrey plant and I was like, you know what, maybe it's like a good pioneer plant to like help like get more organic matter in other places.
No, I think comfrey has a lot of good uses.
But I was looking at the root and I was like, oh shit, I wonder if I could do like root propagation with this.
Yeah, definitely.
Can you talk about root propagation a little bit? Because that's
sure.
something that just like kind of like I tried doing it with like I think Turkish rocket from you, and I don't know if I did it right. No, I did it right because I fucking more Turkish rocket than the law allows. But yeah, so if you could talk about
so
root propagation.
Root propagation is mostly done with herbaceous perennials, so not woody plants. And there's some perennials like comfrey or Turkish rocket that will regenerate from even like a tiny piece of root. So those are super simple. You basically just cut off a piece of fleshy root, so not the little tiny like root hairs, but something that's more looking like a carrot in structure. But it could be a chunk as small as like the smallest joint of your pinky finger, and that would grow just fine. And for those really easy ones, basically all you have to do is put it in the soil and water it, and it's just going to grow. There are other plants, for instance, sea kale is a good example, that are not quite as easy, so I'm a little bit more careful with those.
Sea kale is so hard to grow, I think.
I'd say it's moderate. Like once you've got an established plant, they're pretty easygoing, but it's not the easiest plant to propagate, which is why I would bother with root cuttings rather than just growing it from seed. So when I harvest the roots for sea kale root cuttings, which I sell a lot of, you always want to know which end is up and which end is down. And up is the piece of root, or the end that was closest to the crown of the plant. And so it's always going to sprout out of that side of the root. So I'll have, like a 2 or 3 foot long chunk of root that I'm going to cut up into 2 to 4 inch chunks. And what I'll do is I'll go along and cut it up, and as I'm cutting, I'll make an angled cut on the bottom just to mark which side that is. And for those type of root cuttings, I plant them vertically in the ground with the top of the cutting just barely at the soil surface.
Cool.
And that the little bit of light seems to help stimulate them to start growing new shoots there. If you accidentally got them upside down, they usually will still grow, but they'll sprout out of the bottom, and then that sprout will come out and like do a U-turn and grow up to the surface, which just kind of wastes energy for the plant. And if you have cuttings where you don't know, you're like, oh shit, I lost track of which end is up, just plant them horizontally in the soil and they'll be fine.
So if I had, I think I have at this point like some sea kale from you and some from Joseph Lofthouse. If I would I be better off like if you were me, would you dig up those sea kales and cut the roots to make them bigger, or would you just wait for you to have roots for sale? And
yeah, I would dig them up.
Really?
Yeah, because you could take like if you've got a decent sized plant, it's been growing for at least a year, you could probably take a quarter of the roots, not really hurt the plant much. You're not going to set it back too much by taking a quarter of the roots and get like 4 or 5 new plants out of that, maybe more.
Yeah, I just want a big patch of sea kale because it's so pretty. I think it's one of the prettiest.
Super pretty, really tasty.
The flowers are awesome.
Tons of different like harvest windows. It's a really nice plant. So yeah, I would say, yeah, go ahead and dig up some roots and propagate them. That's definitely a spring thing.
Okay.
You can just leave them in place until spring.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, the root propagation shit blew my mind. I didn't even know about that until you're like, oh, you can do this.
Yeah, and you can do it with woody plants too. It's just less common. And most of the plants that you can propagate from root cuttings are plants that make root suckers anyway. So just the first thing that I'm looking out here and see that would be appropriate is sumac. So sumac has these long running root systems that pop up new shoots all over the place. You can take any little chunk of sumac root, put it in a pot, and it'll just grow, or put it in the soil.
And there are all those other also kind of like experimental style of, not experimental, but, where you nick the side of the branch and stick it.
Yeah, layering.
Yeah, all that kind of shit. What are some, like, if people want to learn about this stuff deeper, what can you recommend any books?
Yeah. There's a book, I think it's called Secrets of Plant Propagation.
Is that the one I bought?
I think so.
I learned a lot from that book.
Yeah. It's just a great, introductory guide. It may not have specifics about, every plant you're interested in, but it'll get you off to a good start, teach you all the, basic techniques, and then you can use Google to be like, okay, how do I propagate Amelanchier ulnifolia, and just a good trick if you need propagation information for any plant. But I would say the first resource to look at is Plants for a Future, which it's never going to have super in-depth information, but it's a good first look. Michael,
and that's pfaf.org, right?
Yes. Michael Durr's book, I think it might be called A Handbook of Plant Propagation or something, is a really awesome resource if you want a paper one. And then using Google, if you type the botanical name of the plant, so the Latin name in quotation marks, followed by the word propagation, that's going to get you the highest quality information, because as you probably know, the internet is full of bad information. There's so much good information, but there's also so much bullshit. And by using the botanical name and the word propagation, you're more likely to turn up higher quality information, scientific papers and stuff from people who have done, carefully done some work to determine what the best way to do it is.
And people who are less quote unquote amateur. I would be oh, here's how you grow stinging nettle, and it's you really want to read about it from somebody who's here's how you grow. What's stinging nettle Latin name?
Urtica dioica.
Yeah, Urtica dioica. All right.
But yeah, there's so much bad hearsay. If you grew stinging nettle with some method and it worked well, that's probably great. It doesn't matter if you know the botanical name, but there's so many people who are oh, this is how you do it, and they've never actually done it, and they heard about it from someone else who heard about it from someone else, and it's just not good information.
Speaking of stinging nettle, that's mint, right? You can root propagate that as well?
Yep. So the structure of nettle, I would say, is a rhizome forming running perennial. So a rhizome is technically not a root, it's underground stem. But yeah, you can just cut a chunk of that basically any time of year and move it, and it'll just keep growing.
A rhizome is not the same thing as a root.
Correct. Yeah. Technically a stem, which is why you can also very bizarrely layer nettle. So you can take a nettle stem, bend it over onto the ground, put a rock on it, and it'll start growing there.
So cool. Awesome, man. Well, yeah, I don't know. I feel like we,
Yeah, that was fun.
I hope somebody grows something. If you
Hopefully that's some useful information for people.
Yeah, if this sets you on a path where you end up trying out some of this stuff, let us know. Send us pictures. Share your surplus. We're starving out here in Maine. Just kidding.
Yeah, well, I hope that information is helpful to people, and like Tim said, we'd love to hear from you if it was or if it wasn't. And I think you probably won't hear from us for at least a few weeks, but over the winter we're hoping to hit up lots of people and talk over the phone and Zoom, and maybe a few people in person in the bitter cold. Our next podcast will come to you from around a campfire.
Oh man, that could I'd be willing to try it once. Maybe yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah. Or we'll just be inside by the wood stove.
You're a little more cold-hardy than I am.
Yeah.
I've spent a little too much time in the Southwest. Like, people come over and I was like, oh my God, you keep it so hot. I'm like,
I hear it's nice there. I've never been.
The Southwest?
Yeah.
It's Sedona, Arizona is just one of the, it's so crazy. It's like just the red rocks, those formations of like the rounded rock river.
I really like cacti, and I've never been to the Southwest, which I'll get there one day, but it might not be soon.
Bring us to your college.
Yeah.
We're down.
Post-COVID.
Cool. Well, thanks for listening. Peace.